My name's Michaela. Really glad to have you here. And I have been finding over the last week or so that one of the things that is most grounding and most rooting about the garden is to spend time in the garden that is tended by someone that you care about, which is exactly what I've been able to do over this past week as I've been here in Pennsylvania visiting with my dad and spending time in his beautiful garden. And he has agreed to sit down with me and just have a little chat about what gardening has meant in our lives, a little bit about his garden here in Western Pennsylvania, and just to share a bit of that with you. So thanks so much, Pop. Welcome to the channel.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So my dad, Jonathan Petty, as I said, is gardening in Western Pennsylvania on a beautiful rural lot. It's a gorgeous old farmhouse and this really beautiful landscape that is a combination of ornamentals and veggie gardens. But most of my life, I did not know my dad as a gardener. I knew you as a musician. I knew him as a scholar and an academic and a writer and an all-around fun guy to spend time with. But I never knew my dad as a gardener until he moved here to Pennsylvania. And so, Dad, I'd love for you to just share a bit about the thread of gardening in your life, just when gardening first came into your life and how you find yourself here as a gardener at this time.
Okay. Well, you didn't know me as a gardener until recently because I haven't been a gardener until recently. But I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California, and that is basically semi-desert. Yeah. And so my first memory of agricultural products, in this case orange trees, well, the San Fernando Valley was almost entirely orange groves when we moved in. And in fact, I can remember standing on the sidewalk. Our house was brand new, and it was right across the street from the last of the orange groves that were being cut down for residences. So it wasn't a really encouraging environment to become aware of the wonders of nature and of accessing nature through gardening. And so I grew up in this semi-desert area, and I didn't have any experience of really of the magic of plants and the magic of life forms, that in your hands, the feeling of running one's hands over a cabbage leaf, for example. Yeah. And but I probably was led to gardening through a series of accidents. The accidents began when during the Vietnam War, I became a draft resister, and which meant that the draft board was constantly after me, and which meant that since I was never going to submit to the draft, that I had to move. And so I had to move, repeatedly, and they would send my draft documents and paperwork after me, and the local board would then try again, and then I'd move again. And in the course of that, a friend of mine invited me up to his commune, hippie commune. This was in the early 70s in Seattle, Washington. And so I moved up there, and
quite a different landscape than Southern California.
Quite a difference indeed. I remember driving up, farther north, and the farther north I went, the more tall walls of dark pine trees and conifers, on either side, and the rain and the moisture, and the people that I ended up living with were very rustic. They were from places like Bellingham, Washington. And and all of my friends were in that environment, that counterculture environment, were back to the land back to the lands people. And so they all gardened on little plots. There was a garden on the back lot of where we were living in this big house together. And my friends Marilyn, friends Marilyn and Paul lived up in Bellingham, Washington, which is a rural Washington town about 90 miles from Canada. Yeah. And I thought I would move up there to be as close to Canada as I could in case I had to jump ship. And but anyway, up in Bellingham, I stayed with my friend Marilyn for some time, and she was an avid gardener, and I fell in love with the raw wood constructions of the raised gardens. I grew avid about going around visiting dumpsters, dumpster diving, and getting any place where they were tearing down an old barn or an old house. Would find us there with an old pickup truck, rooting through the dumpsters or the collapsed building, getting raw wood for our gardens.
This is a habit that I have inherited from you. I can see.
Yes.
I can see finally where it came from.
Yeah, well, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And one of the, it was like another planet. I mean, waking up to the sound of clucking chickens and roosters, I had this strange effect on me.
I get it.
This strange effect, where life was all around me. Little birds, jumping around in the back, and rabbits. There were rabbits, just like in your garden.
Yeah.
And so I helped out a lot in gardens, and I found that was was becoming a necessity for me. The thing that the most wonderful thing about gardening for me is that when I'm outside, it's being outside and feeling oneself to be the central point in a sphere of reality, a physical reality. When one is gardening, one is physically interacting with the most basic reality that a human being can know. I mean, there's not religions and mystical experiences and various esoteric traditions and so forth are all relatively abstract compared with gardening. It's almost as if the natural world were on one pole and esoteric studies and religious experiences were on the other, but connected, not distant from each other, but connected opposites. Yeah. They, counterbalancing each other. The sky arcing over one, the vivid blue, the clouds, the fleecy clouds, then the dirt, digging in the dirt, and the soil, in one's hands, seeds, in one's hands. Just, it's hard to plant a seed and not imagine where it's going to go. Yeah. There's a certain collapsing of time that takes place in gardens. The typical way of saying that is one lives in the now, but one also lives in the future, because the future conflates and compacts into the now, because every seed you plant is destined, for life. Yeah. And so you have the future in your hands, and that becomes a physical experience. You may not think of it that way, but it does. One is sharing in the destiny of a life forms, and uh, they blossom and uh, rise up into uh, life forms that you care for.
Yeah.
You have to cultivate them, and you care for them, and watching their transformations. Uh, so it's a it's a centering experience because one is in the center. One is in fact. I mean, it's not just it's not something you get from meditation. You don't get it by training your mind. Uh, into intense, focus or anything like that. It's more like your mind is petted, like you'd pet a cat, by the texture of reality,
Yeah.
and by being stroked like that, one falls into one's center
Yeah.
without any discipline, really.
I think that really is a really beautiful way of describing with more detail this idea that I always begin with, that we're growing gardens to be rooted and spacious. That, like, that rooting, that centering that you're describing, of being our own center and being connected to this moment in this space, and at the same time that softness, that spaciousness, that expansion that gardening allows our mind to do, where we can be both focused on the moment and on the task at hand, but also so much more aware of the connections that are all present, right? The garden isn't just one thing. It's not that one seed that we're planting, it's all of the connections. Mm-hmm. And there's this simultaneity about how we perceive that I love the way that you're describing. And I'd love to circle back to that a little bit more. And, much of that discovery, that began back in Washington is getting to be tended here. Mm-hmm. So you, traveled through your life. You ended up living in Berkeley, California. It's my hometown. And so most of my life, I knew you as a city kid, a Berkeley resident, working at the university and living in town. And I didn't know about this history that you had with gardening, with open spaces. And when you said that you were going to be moving to Pennsylvania, to the rural part of the state, there was a part of my mind that was really like confused by that. Like, but you're a Berkeley boy. Like, this is where you're from. And it's like, but that's not actually where you were from. That's where you had landed. And so tell us a little bit about that transition from apartment in Berkeley to this space here.
Yeah, well, living in Berkeley, I moved back from from Seattle to the San Francisco Bay Area, and moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Berkeley, California, right next to the University of California, where I worked for about 4 decades. And that was city slicker life. I mean, there's no question about it. Berkeley is an old town. It has wonderful old buildings and old homes and a history. It has great trees, that have grown in the front yards of these old houses for over 100 years old. But we lived in a small space. And we had no yard at all, in a small one-bedroom apartment in an area that was built up, very heavily populated. So, and I lived there for 30 years, and so the liberating experience of nature. The Seattle area was not only an experience of gardening, but of forests and of the rainforest.
Yeah.
Yeah. And moved out for a short time to Orcas Island in the Puget Sound, and the clouds that would flow past the island, right overhead. You could almost stick your finger into them and write your name in them. That was stored in myself and sort of went dormant because it had no opportunity to express itself in Berkeley. I do want to say one other thing about the substance of the experience of gardening for me. When I was in high school, when I was 17 years old, I spent a summer in Japan. Mm. And the most profound experiences of that were walking through these these ancient villas that were made completely of natural wood and with no nails or anything, but with wooden pegs holding them together, and they were vast, beautiful. But it was the texture of wood that I experienced, and the texture of wood to me became infused with a spirituality thing, because in the temples were all wood and carved, elegantly carved, but natural and raw, without any metal at all. Yeah. So that experience I had, that was my sort of preliminary experience of later nature. So that these pieces of wood that we'd get out of the dumpsters resonated with the wood that I'd experienced in Japan, and carried some of the spiritual weight of my Japanese experiences, which were quite spiritual. So when we moved back here, we have a plenty of space to work with. So that was when the gardening came back to life. And it actually has a continuity that goes all the way back to 1966, when I was in Japan. And the Japanese gardens, the Japanese garden was another profound experience. I studied Japanese and Japanese language and Japanese culture and Japanese history, and the naturalness of Japanese poetry. Which was rooted in the actual physical landscape.
Well, and it makes perfect sense that like one of the first things you did when you got here was to start building with wood, right? To start gathering up resources and materials from this area, the stone wall that you brought here to, build a support for the cherry tree in the front, the beautiful grape arbor that, has a Japanese design to it, built of wood. It was really powerful for me to see you just take that up with so much like authority and clarity. Like this is like, it was like something was unleashed, right? And I had gotten this tiny glimpse of it maybe a few years before. You have this like, in that apartment in Berkeley, you had this tiny little, I don't even know if you could call it a porch. It was like this sort of outdoor area, that I was not even fully aware of for years. Because we never went out there. It wasn't even a proper porch. It was just this little, you could step outside this door and there was a little fence there. And I remember at a certain point, you were growing vegetables out there. And, they didn't get enough light and there wasn't enough space.
And I hadn't enough skill.
And you hadn't enough skill. But it was this like, I remember that just really stuck in my mind, because the first time, I had not had any exposure to gardening really at that point. And it was this like, my dad is like growing tomatoes out on this little porch I didn't even really know existed. And it was this like opening of something. And one of my gardening mentors, I talk about a lot on this channel, Jess from Roots and Refuge Farm, she always talks about turning your waiting room into a classroom. That whatever, desire of our heart we have, whatever goal that we have that isn't fulfilled yet, and we want for it, we long for it, but we're not there yet. We can waste a lot of time waiting and longing for that thing and not really doing anything towards it. Or we can take that waiting time as a classroom time and do what we can with the space that we have, with the inclination that we have to learn, some little piece of what that larger expression is. And I really see that in those little scruffy tomatoes that you grew on that porch, right? This like impulse to use that time, that waiting time when you were so constricted, to put your hands to something, right? To put your hands to soil in some way. And then the moment you got here, it was just like full speed ahead, right? Get the garden going. And I'm really curious, from now that you're 16 years in, so they've been here 16 years, and clearly like working with this land and being in relationship with this land in that whole time. I'd love to hear a bit more about what impact that has on you, just in your daily life, how it makes you feel, thinking, like however you want to interpret that question. But what has been the impact of 16 years of gardening on your life?
Well, I have to say that it was a wonderful experience to be 40 years in Berkeley and associated with the university for all of that time. But on the other hand, it is an extremely one-sided way to live a life. To live a life of books and theories and professors, and students and it's
A dense city.
it nourishes a very valid and a large part of my life. But when we moved here, I had become one-sided, unbalanced, unbalanced. And I saw this, we have about a 3/4 of an acre here. And I saw that as just, an opportunity to get outdoors, just get outdoors and not think. Not think, but feel. On the Myers-Briggs test, psychological test, I come across as very weak in my sensation function. And which means that the grasp of physical reality and actually living in the world right now has always been weak with me. But I went into this gardening just like a fish into water. It was, and there was nothing out there in our yard except a lawn when I moved in, and now we have all kinds of gardening infrastructure out there. I have to say that for me, a good deal of the joy and liberating force of gardening has been building things. It's not just plants. It's plants are the major focus of it, and that means vegetables and flowers. For me, it's vegetables and flowers. But building structures, I built a Tory gate out there, and have walkways, gravel walkways and raised gardens, raised beds, and a gazebo out there, kind of a rose covered and vine covered little hut, and fences and so forth. And so I built that all by myself. Gardening hasn't been a community building experience for me. It's been very much a solitary experience, but that's wonderful because the me that was emerging out of that solitariness was quite happy. I was quite happy to be becoming that kind of a person. So I would say that gardening has been a creative experience for me, and also a kind of a validating one, in that I didn't know if I had any ability to physically work with my hands and build stuff. And so the structures that I've built out there are very rustic. I basically have built all of my structures out there with basically a saw and a shovel and a hammer and a drill. The most basic tools.
And teaching yourself to put structures together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, no hint of a floor plan or anything like that. They've all been done spontaneously. And I really like them.
Yeah.
I
do
really
too.
like them. I mean, it's very important to me that I make my mark on whatever I'm doing. And making my mark on the backyard, you know, has been really satisfying to me. You know, I look at these structures that I built, and they they're not at all professional. There's nothing professional about them. And, you know, so after, you know, professors and so on, you know, that something that is mine and not at all professional is really
no
liberating.
editor has to come and approve what you're doing
precisely.
here. I love, you know, we share that in common as well. And, you know, the first videos I posted on this channel were a tour of the infrastructure projects that I had done on my garden over the past couple of seasons. And I pointed out that same like wonkiness and like there's not, you know, exactly straight angles anywhere. And, you know, it feels very much handmade and done by someone who's not at all precise or like architectural. And that I like that, you know. And then there's certain projects that I did want to take more care and be more precise and measure more cleanly, and others that I just paid somebody else to do because it was truly outside of my wheelhouse. But that building of infrastructure being, you know, a significant part of the pleasure of it. And then the other thing that's really standing out with several things that you've said is the way that a garden integrates, right? I mean, a garden is an integration. It's an integration of so many life forms and elements and, you know, processes that are all working together. And, you know, you started off talking about, you know, spirituality and religion versus like the material, you know, hands-on in the moment experience of life, and how those are integrated with each other, not disintegrated, but also different as far as how we're experiencing the world. I experience the garden very much as a place where those things come together. This idea of the intellect, you know, the mind, and then the body and the creativity, the heart coming together in the garden. And, you know, precision and artfulness and creativity coming together in the garden. And yeah, I'm really hearing that theme of integration coming through in what you're sharing.
Yes, I would say so. One aspect of that integration is that since gardening has been a balancing experience for me, that is restoring the balance of my personality so that it's not mental, not so mental, that I've approached it without research. You know, I mean, I haven't, for example, there are gardeners, you know, when you look up the literature of gardening on the web, you find hundreds and thousands of sites in which they describe the pH levels, you know, and the you know, the way of composting and the way, you know, and you know, they share the wealth of knowledge that gardeners have acquired and are now freely sharing with each other on the web. And you know, that those are you know, you can find out information on the you know, the best way to grow watermelons, you know, and grow flowers. But I haven't been that scientific about it. I've been very much a trial and error gardener. And so my experience of gardening has been very much the experience of mistakes that I've made. And I make those mistakes. And there was a certain gumption sucking aspect to making mistakes when you're starting something new. You know, you just make mistake after mistake, and you know, some things are fine and you don't know why they're fine one year and then they flop the next, and you weren't sure whether it was an accident that they were fine the first year. You know, and your gumption kind of gets drained out of you. So there's a certain moral quality to forging ahead, you know, in spite of all of the mistakes. And one thing I have learned is that there are no perfect gardens and there's no perfect planting. Um, plants are absolutely precisely attuned to the spot that they grow in, and you would have to be a professional to really be able to be sure that you are giving them everything that they need.
Yeah.
And I've had a profession, so I'm not I'm not looking for a profession
Right,
in
right.
gardening. Yeah.
Well, ultimately, plants want to grow, right? And they
Yeah.
know so much more about what they need than we do. And gardening is so much a collaboration. And that was a hard lesson that I had to learn, because when I first started gardening in the Bay Area, the Berkeley area, it's relatively easy to grow there. The climate is super mild. I just had good growing conditions, and gardening seemed really easy. Like, stuff, you put a seed in the ground, it grew. There wasn't a lot of failure that we experienced in that first garden, which was a blessing because I really needed it at the time to just work well. But when I moved to Davis, very different climate. It was kind of the opposite of your move from Southern California to Washington. I moved from the Bay Area, which was a more cool and moist climate, to a very dry and hot climate. It was just one failure after the next. And I realized I didn't actually know that much about gardening because it had just come easily in the Bay. And I was incredibly discouraged, and ultimately I gave it up. And like, coming back to the garden required embracing mistakes, and it required approaching it with curiosity and a love for the process, and for growing myself as a gardener more so than growing any one garden particularly well. And that was a huge mindset shift. Like, it wouldn't, I would still not be gardening if I hadn't come to embrace mistakes and to, see the cyclical nature of the garden. That, okay, the tomatoes were crap this year. Next year I'll try something different. We'll see what happens, Yeah, so I love that.
Another daunting aspect of gardening, which is probably afflicts young gardeners or beginning gardeners, is the sheer difficulty of it. I mean, it's hard work.
Yeah.
I don't mean that it's difficult like acrobatics, but it's difficult like it's
labor.
Very labor. It's labor intensive, and it's time based. That is, if you don't plant in time, your crop won't prosper. One thing about this area, which is western Pennsylvania, is that the winters are so long that one can't really grow successfully, expect to be successful at planting if you plant much before late May, and then by October, it's
You're done.
you're done. So this is no kind of double crop, area. It's the winter season stays cool and even snowy all the way into April. There will be snows in April, sometimes even in May.
Wow.
So that means that you have to be very precise on when you plant.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that what you will read on the seed packets about when to plant and when to expect your crop, 65 days till maturity, is very rarely true.
Yeah. You better count those days carefully.
Very rarely
right?
true. Yeah.
Well, speaking of seed packets, what's your favorite things to grow?
My favorite things to grow are very basic vegetables, potatoes. I have a special love for the potato. I feel something akin with the potato. There's something potato-like about my personality, and so that is good. Beans and tomatoes and cabbages and let's see, asparagus. Asparagus.
Did you get your asparagus replanted?
No, I've been still contemplating that, whether to try again. I had a asparagus patch that had been very prolific for 5 years, and then the 6th year it just didn't come up, and they had all died.
Wow.
And I don't know why. And so that's daunting too.
Yeah.
When you have
you
something.
Invest.
Yeah. that was a year when bushes in the backyard failed and died, and vegetables wouldn't yield, and the asparagus died, and it was like yeah.
It can be hard to recover from a heartbreak like that.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Because the asparagus is the sign of spring. It comes up early. And the little asparagus shoots coming up.
It's
And
so
oh boy,
hopeful.
spring is here.
Well,
Yeah,
Pop, I'd love to, first of all, thank you for having this conversation with
certainly.
me. It's been such a delight getting to connect over gardening over this past decade, really. And I'm thinking back to my own time of being in a waiting room, of not really embracing being a gardener yet, being really intimidated by it. And so I'm curious what you might say to somebody who's in that position, the first time gardener, or the person who is longing to garden, or who's in their waiting room phase and hasn't quite yet gotten that piece of soil that they can work with. What would you say to that first time garden to encourage them?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that there are many kinds of gardener and many kinds of enterprise that people think they're going into when they're working with the soil. There are, for example, your friend Hope, with her farm.
Yep.
I mean, she has gone, I assume that she started small, she started
school
as
gardens.
School garden,
Mm-hmm.
and then she blossomed into an entire farm.
Yeah.
And she did that, I'm sure, by increasing her knowledge, and I'm sure she studied and read a lot and inquired a lot of other people that were that had done similar things. And so if one is going into gardening and feeling that one wants to live a natural life, and be farming, or expand in that direction, that's one kind of experience. And for those people, you should learn as much as you can.
Yeah.
You should and communicate as much as you can with like-minded people on the internet. If you have a more limited goal, which is what mine is, then you might value learning for yourself. Trying this and trying that, and experimenting, just experimentation. But I would say that to really get the most out of it, you should balance knowledge with activity. There's different relationships, ratios between activity and knowledge, and I'm probably on the activity level more on the knowledge level.
Yeah.
So.
Which, as you say, has been a good balancing point to the way you've lived the rest of your life, which was very knowledge centered. Yeah.
So I would say that young gardeners should be clear on their reasons, to be as clear as they can on why they're doing it. So sometimes you don't know why you do something; you're just drawn into it. And if you're drawn into it, you might end up more of an activity kind of person than a knowledge person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really wise to pay attention to where we are on that spectrum, and then kind of fill in where maybe we haven't been as focused in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, awesome. Well, friends, we hope this conversation has been inspiring for you. I'd love to know where you are in your gardening journey. Are you dreaming of the garden? Are you deep in the soil already? Let us know where you are in that journey. Let us know what came up for you as you listened to this conversation. And what is the thread that you followed to the garden that brought you into this lifestyle? I'd love to know. And before we close this out completely, this really lovely nexus between my family life, my life as a gardener, and my life with all of you here on YouTube. I'd love to invite all of you to just take a little walk with me out in my Pop's garden, just share a little bit, a few vignettes from this beautiful space that you have created. So why don't you come out with us, take a little walk out in the garden.